Dilthey's entanglement in the Aporeus of historicism. From the epistemological problem of history to the hermeneutic foundation of the human sciences. The tension between aesthetic hermeneutics and the philosophy of history comes to a climax with Wilhelm Dilthey. Dilthey owes his importance to the fact that he recognizes the epistemological problem that the historical view implies with respect to idealism. As Schleiermacher's biographer and a historian who, with the romantic theory of understanding, asks the historical question about the rise and nature of hermeneutics and writes the history of Western metaphysics, he moves within the horizon of problems implicit in German idealism. However, as a student of Ranke and the new empiricism of that century, his thinking is so different that neither the aesthetic pantheistic identity philosophy of Schleiermacher nor Hegel's metaphysics, integrated with the philosophy of history, remain valid for him. It is true that in Ranke and Droysen we found minds similarly torn between idealism and empiricism. But in Dilthey, this dichotomy becomes particularly acute. For him, it is no longer the mere continuation of the classic romantic spirit together with an empirical conception of research, but this continuing tradition is overlaid by his conscious adoption of the ideas first of Schleiermacher and later of Hegel. Even when we exclude the early and great influence of British empiricism and the epistemology of the natural sciences on Dilthey as being a distortion of his real intentions, it is still not easy to understand what these intentions were. Georg Misch has taken an important step in this direction. However, since Misch wanted to confront Dilthey's position with Husserl's phenomenology and the fundamental ontology of Heidegger, he described the inner conflict in Dilthey's life philosophy in terms of these contemporary contrasting positions. The same may be said of O.F. Boilnow. The root of the conflict in Dilthey lies in the historical school's intermediate position between philosophy and experience. Far from being obviated by Dilthey's attempt to provide an epistemological foundation, it is rendered more acute. Dilthey's attempt to provide a philosophical foundation for the human sciences endeavors to draw the epistemological consequences of what Ranke and Droysen asserted against German idealism. Dilthey himself was fully aware of this. He viewed the weakness of the historical school as a lack of logical consistency in its thinking. Instead of going back to the epistemological postulates of the historical school and those of idealism from Kant to Hegel, and thus recognizing the incompatibility of these postulates, they have uncritically combined these 2 points of view. Thus, he set himself the task of constructing a new and more viable epistemological basis between historical experience and the idealistic heritage of the historical school. This is the meaning of his intention to complement Kant's critique of pure reason with a critique of historical reason. This aim in itself exhibits his withdrawal from speculative idealism. It sets up an analogy that has to be understood in a quite literal way. Dilthey wants to say that historical reason calls for the same kind of justification as pure reason. The epoch-making result of the critique of pure reason was not only that it destroyed metaphysics as a purely rational science of the world, the soul, and God, but that at the same time, it revealed an area within which the use of a priori concepts is justified, and which makes knowledge possible. The critique of pure reason not merely destroyed the dreams of a seer, it also answered the question of how pure science is possible. Meanwhile, speculative idealism had integrated the world of history into the self-analysis of reason, and moreover, especially through Hegel, had performed remarkable feats, precisely in the historical field. Thus, the claim of the pure science of reason was extended to historical knowledge. It was a part of the encyclopedia of mind. But in the eyes of the historical school, speculative philosophy of history was a dogmatism no less crass than rational metaphysics. So that school had to provide a philosophical grounding for historical knowledge of the same kind that Kant achieved for the knowledge of nature. This demand was not to be fulfilled by simply going back to Kant, as it might have seemed from the aberrations of nature philosophy. Kant had brought to conclusion the work on the problem of knowledge as it was posed by the emergence of the new science in the 17th century. Kant provided the mathematico-scientific mode of construction, used by the new science, with the epistemological justification it needed, because its ideas had no claim to existence other than as entia rationis. The old representationalist theory was clearly no longer adequate. Thus, because of the incommensurability of thought and being, the problem of knowledge was posed in a new way. Dilthey saw this clearly, and in his correspondence with Count York, he speaks of the nominalist background of 17th-century epistemology, which has been brilliantly verified by modern research since Duhem. The problem of epistemology acquires a new urgency through the historical sciences. We learn this from linguistic history, for the word Erkenntnistheorie, epistemology, arose only in the period after Hegel. It came into use when empirical research had discredited the Hegelian system. The 19th century became the century of epistemology because, with the dissolution of Hegelian philosophy, the correspondence between logos and being was finally destroyed. In that Hegel taught reason in everything, even in history, he was the last and most universal representative of ancient logos philosophy. Now, in view of the critique of the a priori philosophy of history, people were drawn again under the spell of Kant's critique, whose problem was now posed for the historical world as well, since the claim to provide a purely rational construction of world history had been rejected, and historical knowledge was likewise limited to experience. If history is considered to be no more a manifestation of mind than is nature, then how the human mind can know history becomes just as problematic as how nature can be known through mathematical constructs had been for Kant. Thus, just as Kant had answered the question of how pure science was possible, Dilthey had to answer the question of how historical experience can become a science. Hence, in a clear analogy to the Kantian question, he sought to discover the categories of the historical world that would be able to support the human sciences. What constitutes Dilthey's special importance and distinguishes him from the Neo-Kantians, who tried to involve the human sciences in the renewal of critical philosophy, is that he does not forget that in this instance experience is something quite different from what it is in the investigation of nature. In the latter, all that matters are verifiable discoveries arising from experience, i.e., that which detaches itself from an individual's experience and constitutes part of the reliable stock of experimental knowledge. For the Neo-Kantians, the categorical analysis of this object of knowledge had been the positive achievement of transcendental philosophy. Simply to adapt Kant's construction and apply it to the field of historical knowledge, as Neo-Kantianism did in the form of the philosophy of value, could not satisfy Dilthey. He considered Neo-Kantian critical philosophy itself to be dogmatic, and he was equally correct in calling British empiricism dogmatic. For the structure of the historical world is not based on facts taken from experience which then acquire a value relation, but rather on the inner historicity that belongs to experience itself. What we call experience, Erfahrung, and acquire through experience, is a living historical process, and its paradigm is not the discovery of facts, but the peculiar fusion of memory and expectation into a whole. Thus, what pre-shapes the special mode of knowing in the historical sciences is the suffering and instruction that the person who is growing in insight receives from the painful experience of reality. The historical sciences only advance and broaden the thought already implicit in the experience of life. Thus, epistemological inquiry here begins with a different starting point. In some ways, its task is easier. It does not need to investigate the grounds of the possibility of the fact that our ideas accord with the external world. We are concerned here with knowledge of the historical world, and that is always a world constituted and formed by the human mind. For this reason, Dilthey does not regard the universally valid synthetic judgments of history as any problem. Here he finds support in Vico. We recall that, in reaction against Cartesian doubt and the certainty of the mathematical knowledge of nature based on it, Vico asserted the epistemological primacy of the man-made historical world. Dilthey repeats the same argument and writes, "The first condition of possibility of a science of history is that I myself am a historical being, that the person studying history is the person making history. What makes historical knowledge possible is the homogeneity of subject and object. This, however, is no solution to the epistemological problem that Dilthey posed. Rather, positing homogeneity as its condition conceals the real epistemological problem of history. The question is how the individual's experience and the knowledge of it come to be historical experience. In history, we are no longer concerned with coherent wholes that are experienced as such by the individual or are re-experienced as such by others. Dilthey's argument applies only to the experiencing and re-experiencing done by the individual, and this is the starting point for his epistemological theory. By elaborating the way an individual's life acquires continuity, Dilthey hopes to obtain constitutive concepts that will serve to ground both historical continuity and the knowledge of it. Unlike the categories of the study of nature, these concepts are drawn from life. For Dilthey, the ultimate presupposition for knowledge of the historical world is experience, Erlebnis. In it, the identity between consciousness and object, that postulate of speculative idealism, is still demonstrable reality. This is where immediate certitude is to be found, for experience is no longer divided into an act, a becoming conscious, and a content, that of which one is conscious. It is rather indivisible consciousness. Even to say that experience is of something is to make too great a division. Dilthey now investigates how continuity is created from the element of the world of the mind that is immediately certain, and how the knowledge of this continuity is possible. Even in his ideas on descriptive and analytical psychology, Dilthey was trying to explain how one's inner life is woven into continuity, Zusammenhang, in a way that is different from explaining the knowledge of nature by appeal to the categories. He used the concept of structure to distinguish the experiential character of psychological continuity from the causal continuity of natural processes. Logically, structure is distinguished by its referring to a totality of relationships that do not depend on a temporal, causal succession, but on intrinsic connections. In structure, Dilthey thought he had found a valid starting point and had overcome the shortcomings of Ranke and Droysen's methodological reflections. But he conceded that the historical school was right on one point. There was no such thing as a universal subject, only historical individuals. The ideality of meaning was not to be located in a transcendental subject, but emerged from the historical reality of life. It is life itself that unfolds and forms itself in intelligible unities, and it is in terms of the single individual that these unities are understood. This is the self-evident starting point for Dilthey's analysis. The continuity of life as it appears to the individual, and is re-experienced and understood by others through biographical knowledge, is created through the significance of particular experiences, Erlebnis. Around them, as around an organizing center, the unity of a life is created in the same way that a melody acquires its form, not from the mere succession of notes, but from the musical motifs that determine its formal unity. It is clear that here also, as with Droysen, the method of romantic hermeneutics is being expanded into universality. Like the coherence of a text, the structural coherence of life is defined as a relation between the whole and the parts. Every part expresses something of the whole of life, i.e., has significance for the whole, just as its own significance is determined by the whole. It is the old hermeneutical principle of textual interpretation, and it applies to the coherence of life insofar as life presupposes a unity of meaning that is expressed in all its parts. The decisive step for Dilthey's epistemological grounding of the human sciences is the transition from the structure of coherence in an individual's experience to historical coherence, which is not experienced by any individual at all. Despite all the critique of speculation, it is necessary to put logical subjects instead of real subjects. Dilthey is aware of this difficulty, but he considers it permissible since the way individuals belong together, as in the solidarity of one generation or one nation, represents a spiritual reality that must be recognized as such precisely because it is not possible to get behind it in order to explain it. True, This is not a real subject, that is clear enough from the fluidity of its boundaries. Moreover, individuals are involved in it with only a part of their being. But for Dilthey, there is no question that statements can be made about this kind of subject. The historian does it constantly when he speaks of the deeds and destinies of peoples. The question is simply how such statements can be justified epistemologically. It cannot be said that Dilthey's thinking on this point, which he himself sees as the key problem, reached perfect clarity. The decisive problem here is making the transition from a psychological to a hermeneutical grounding of the human sciences. Dilthey never got beyond mere sketches of it. So it is that the two completed parts of the Aufbau, autobiography and biography, which are both special cases of historical experience and knowledge, retain an undue preponderance. For the real historical problem, as we have seen, is less how coherence is generally experienced and known than how a coherence that no one has experienced can be known. Still, there can be no doubt about the way Dilthey would have clarified the problem of understanding. To understand is to understand an expression. What is expressed is present in the expression in a different way than the cause is present in the effect. It is present in the expression itself and will be understood when the expression is understood. From the outset, Dilthey's efforts were directed toward distinguishing relationships in the historical world from the causal relationships of the natural order, and so the concepts of understanding and expression were always central for him. The methodological clarity he achieved through Husserl's influence allowed him in the end to integrate the concept of significance, a concept that arises from the continuity of effect, with the latter's logical investigations. Dilthey's concept of the structural quality of the life of spirit corresponds to the theory of the intentionality of consciousness in that structure is not merely a psychological fact, but the phenomenological description of an essential quality of consciousness. Every consciousness is consciousness of something. Every relation is a relation to something. According to Husserl, the correlative of this intentionality, the intentional object, is not a psychic component but an ideal unity, and meant as such. Thus, Husserl's first logical investigation defended the concept of the one ideal significance against the prejudices of logical psychologism. This demonstration came to assume key importance for Dilthey, for it was only as a result of Husserl's analysis that he was able to say what distinguished structure from causal continuity. An example will make this clear. A psychic structure, say an individual, acquires their individuality by developing their talents and at the same time experiencing the conditioning effect of circumstances. What emerges, the actual individuality, i.e. the character of the individual, is not a mere consequence of the causal factors, nor to be understood only in terms of these causes, but it constitutes a unity that is intelligible in itself, a unity of life that is expressed in every one of its manifestations, and hence can be understood in each of them. Something becomes fused here to form a unique configuration, independently of the system of cause and effect. This is what Dilthey meant by structural continuity, and what, with Husserl, he now calls significance. Dilthey can now also say to what extent structural coherence is given, his chief bone of contention with Ebbinghaus. It is not given in the immediacy of an experience, but neither is it simply constructed on the basis of the mechanism of the psyche as the result of causal factors. Rather, the theory of the intentionality of consciousness provides a new foundation for the idea of givenness. Now one can no longer derive coherence from atoms of experience, Erlebnis, or explain it in this way. Consciousness, rather, is always already involved in coherence and has its own being in intending it. Thus Dilthey considered Husserl's logical investigations epoch-making because he had legitimized such concepts as structure and significance, although they were not derivable from elements. They were now shown to be more fundamental than the elements from and upon which they were supposed to be built. True, Husserl's demonstration of the ideality of significance was the result of purely logical investigations. What Dilthey makes of it is something quite different. For him, significance is not a logical concept, but is to be understood as an expression of life. Life itself, flowing temporality, is ordered toward the formation of enduring units of significance. Life interprets itself. Life itself has a hermeneutical structure. Thus, life constitutes the real ground of the human sciences. Hermeneutics is not a romantic heritage in Dilthey's thinking, but follows from the fact that philosophy is grounded in life. Dilthey believes that here he has risen entirely above the intellectualism of Hegel. Nor could the romantic and pantheistic concept of individuality that derived from Leibniz satisfy him. Grounding philosophy in life defends it against the metaphysics of individuality, and consciously distances it from the viewpoint of Leibniz's windowless monads that develop their own law. Individuality now is not a primordial idea rooted in phenomena. Rather, Dilthey insists that all psychological life is subject to the force of circumstances. There is no such thing as the originating power of individuality. It becomes what it is by carrying itself out. Essential to the idea of individuality, as of all historical ideas, is that it is limited by the course of its effect. Even concepts like purpose and significance are not, for Dilthey, ideas in the Platonic or scholastic sense. They, too, are historical ideas, for they are limited by the course of their effect. They must be concepts of energy. Dilthey here relies on Fichte, who also had an important influence on Ranke. Thus, Dilthey's hermeneutics of life fundamentally seeks to retain the historical worldview. Philosophy gives him only the conceptual tools to declare the latter's truth. Despite these qualifications, however, it is still not clear whether Dilthey's grounding of hermeneutics in life really avoided the implicit consequences of idealistic metaphysics. He sees the question as follows: how is the power of the individual related to what exists beyond and prior to them, objective spirit? What is the relation between power and significance, between forces and ideas, between the facticity and the ideality of life? This question must ultimately decide how knowledge of history is possible. For man in history is similarly wholly defined by the relation between individuality and objective spirit. Now, this relationship is clearly not unambiguous. It is, on the one hand, the experience of limitation, pressure, and resistance, through which the individual becomes aware of their own power. But it is not only the solid walls of actuality that they experience. Rather, as a historical being, they experience historical realities which support the individual and in which they at once express and rediscover themselves. As such, they are not solid walls but objectifications of life. Droysen spoke of moral forces. This is of great methodological importance for specifying the nature of the human sciences. Here, the concept of the given has a basically different structure. Characteristic of the given in the human, unlike the natural, sciences is that one has to discard all ideas of anything fixed or alien, which are appropriate to images of the physical world. Here, the given is something made. Dilthey regards the old superiority that Vico attributed to historical objects as the ground of the universality with which understanding grasps the historical world. The question is, however, whether the transition from the psychological to the hermeneutical standpoint can really succeed on this basis, or whether Dilthey is ensnared in problems that bring him into undesired and unacknowledged proximity to speculative idealism. For not only Fichte but Hegel can be heard in the passage referred to, even in the very words. His critique of the concept of self-alienation, the definition of mind as recognition of oneself in other being, can easily be derived from Dilthey's statement. And we may ask wherein lies the difference that the historical worldview asserted against idealism and that Dilthey undertook to validate epistemologically. This question becomes more pressing when we consider the central phrase with which Dilthey characterizes life, this basic fact of history. He speaks of the thought-forming work of life. It is not easy to say how this phrase differs from Hegel. However life may present, and however much Dilthey may mock the over-optimistic view that regards life as only the progress of civilization, insofar as it is understood in terms of the thoughts that it forms. A teleological interpretative schema is imposed on life, and it is conceived as spirit. Accordingly, we find that in his later years, Dilthey draws closer and closer to Hegel and speaks of spirit where he used to say life. He is simply repeating a conceptual development that Hegel himself underwent. In light of this fact, it is interesting to note that we owe to Dilthey the knowledge of the early, so-called theological, writings of Hegel. It emerges quite clearly from this material, which helps us to understand the evolution of Hegel's thinking, that his concept of spirit was based on a spiritual concept of life. Dilthey himself tried to give an account of what he has in common with Hegel and what separates them. But what does his critique of Hegel's belief in reason, his speculative construction of world history, and his a prioristic deduction of all ideas from the dialectical self-unfolding of the absolute amount to, if he himself still gives the concept of objective mind such a central place? It is true that Dilthey opposes Hegel's abstract construction of this concept. Today, we must start from the reality of life. He writes, "We are seeking to understand the latter and present it in suitable concepts. Freed from the idealist construction and from being based one-sidedly on universal reason as expressing the essence of world spirit, a new concept of objective mind becomes possible. It comprises language, customs, every form of life, as well as the family, civil society, state, and law. And what Hegel calls absolute spirit as distinct from objective, namely, art, religion, and philosophy, also come under this concept. Without a doubt, this is an adaptation of Hegel. What does it mean? How far does it take account of the reality of life? The most significant thing is obviously Dilthey's extending the concept of objective spirit to art, religion, and philosophy. For this means that Dilthey does not regard them as immediate truth, but as forms in which life expresses itself. In putting art and religion on the same level as philosophy, he is likewise rejecting the claim of the speculative concept. At the same time, Dilthey is not denying that these forms take precedence over the other forms of objective spirit, for precisely in their powerful forms, spirit objectifies itself and is known. This priority of a perfect self-knowledge of spirit was what caused Hegel to view these as forms of absolute spirit. There was no longer anything alien in them, and hence spirit was entirely at home with itself. For Dilthey, too, as we have seen, the objectifications of art represented the real triumph of hermeneutics. Thus he differs from Hegel ultimately on one thing only, that according to Hegel the homecoming of the spirit takes place in the philosophical concept, whereas for Dilthey, the philosophical concept is significant not as knowledge, but as expression. Thus we must ask whether there is not also for Dilthey a form of the spirit that is truly absolute spirit, i.e., transparency, the complete dissolution of all alienness, of all difference. For Dilthey, there is no question that it exists and that what corresponds to this ideal is historical consciousness, not speculative philosophy. It sees all the phenomena of the human, historical world only as objects by means of which the spirit knows itself more fully. Understanding them as objectifications of spirit, it translates them back into the mental life whence they came. Thus, for historical consciousness, the forms that objective spirit takes are objects of this spirit's self-knowledge. Historical consciousness expands to universality, for it sees all the data of history as manifestations of the life from which they stem. Here, life is understood by life. Hence, for historical consciousness, the whole of tradition becomes the self-encounter of the human mind. Historical consciousness appropriates what seemed specially reserved to art, religion, and philosophy. It is not in the speculative knowledge of the concept, but in historical consciousness that spirit's knowledge of itself is consummated. Historical consciousness discerns historical spirit in all things. Even philosophy is to be regarded only as an expression of life. Insofar as philosophy is aware of this, It will give up its old claim to be knowledge through concepts. It becomes the philosophy of philosophy, a philosophical account of why there is philosophy in life, side by side with science. In his later writings, Dilthey outlined this kind of philosophy, and there he attributed the various types of worldviews to the variousness of the life that interprets itself. This historical overcoming of metaphysics is linked to the interpretation of great literature, which Dilthey regarded as the triumph of hermeneutics. But philosophy and art retain only a relative importance for the consciousness that understands historically. They assume a special place because mind does not have to be separated out of them by interpretation, since they are sheer expression and do not seek to be anything other than that. But even as such, they are not immediate truth, but serve only as an organ for understanding life. Just as certain high points of a civilization more readily reveal the spirit of that civilization, and just as the really significant historical decisions appear in the plans and deeds of great men, so too philosophy and art are especially open to interpretive understanding. Here, intellectual history avails itself of form, the pure development of meaningful wholes that have freed themselves from the stream of becoming. In the introduction to his biography of Schleiermacher, Dilthey writes, "The history of intellectual movements has the advantage of possessing truthful monuments. One can be wrong about the intention, but not about the content of the actual inner self that is expressed in these works. It is no accident that Dilthey has passed on to us this note of Schleiermacher's. The blossom is the real maturity. The fruit is only the chaotic covering for what no longer belongs to the organic plant." Dilthey obviously shares this aesthetic metaphysics. It is at the basis of his relation to history. This corresponds to the transformed concept of objective mind with which historical consciousness replaces metaphysics. But we may ask whether historical consciousness is really able to fill the place vacated by Hegel's absolute knowledge, in which spirit comprehends itself in the speculative concept. Dilthey himself has pointed out that we understand historically because we are ourselves historical beings. This is supposed to make things easier epistemologically, but does it? Is Vico's oft-repeated formula correct? Does it not transpose an experience of the human artistic spirit to the historical world, where, in the face of the course of events, one can no longer speak of making, i.e., of planning and carrying out? How are things made easier epistemologically? Are they not, in fact, made more difficult? Is not the fact that consciousness is historically conditioned inevitably an insuperable barrier to its reaching perfect fulfillment in historical knowledge? Hegel could regard this barrier as overcome by virtue of history's being superseded by absolute knowledge. But if life is the inexhaustible creative reality that Dilthey thinks it, then must not the constant alteration of historical context preclude any knowledge from attaining to objectivity? Is it not the case, then, that historical consciousness is ultimately a utopian ideal, containing an internal contradiction? The conflict between science and life philosophy in Dilthey's analysis of historical consciousness. Dilthey thought about this problem tirelessly. He was always attempting to legitimate the knowledge of what was historically conditioned as an achievement of objective science, despite the fact that the knower is himself conditioned. It was to be legitimated by the theory of structure, which builds up its unity out of its own center. That a structured whole could be understood in terms of its own center corresponded to the old principle of hermeneutics, and to the insistence of historical thinking that an age should be understood in terms of itself, and not according to the criterion of some alien present. Dilthey thought that the knowledge of increasingly large historical units could be conceived according to this schema, and expanded to constitute knowledge of universal history, just as a word can be understood only in terms of the whole sentence, and the sentence fully understood only within the context of the whole text, indeed of the whole of literature. Applying this schema presumes, of course, that one can overcome the fact that the historical observer is tied to time and place. But this is precisely the claim of historical consciousness, namely to have a truly historical viewpoint on everything. It sees this as its culminating achievement. Hence it is concerned to develop the historical sense in order to transcend the prejudices of one's own time. Thus, Dilthey considered himself the true perfecter of the historical worldview, because he sought to justify the rise of consciousness to historical consciousness. What his epistemological thinking tried to justify was fundamentally nothing other than the epic self-forgetfulness of Ranke. But in place of aesthetic self-forgetfulness, there was the sovereignty of an infinite understanding. Basing historical study on a psychology of understanding, as Dilthey hoped to do, transports the historian to the ideative contemporaneity, with his object that we call aesthetic, and that we admire in Ranke. Yet the important question remains how such infinite understanding is possible for finite human nature. Can this really have been Dilthey's meaning? For did he not insist against Hegel that one must preserve the consciousness of one's own finitude? Let us examine this more closely. Dilthey's critique of Hegel's rational idealism was concerned only with the a priorism of his conceptual speculation. Fundamentally, he did not hesitate about the inner infinity of the mind, for he saw it as positively fulfilled in the ideal of a historically enlightened reason that has matured into a genius who understands everything. For Dilthey, the awareness of finitude does not mean that consciousness was made finite or limited in any way. Rather, that awareness bears witness to the capacity of life to rise in energy and activity above all limitations. Thus, it represents precisely the potential infinity of the mind, though it is not in speculation, but in historical reason that this infinity is realized. Historical understanding expands to embrace all historical data and is truly universal because it has a firm foundation in the inner totality and infinity of mind. Here, Dilthey is following the old theory that understanding is possible because of the homogeneity of human nature. He sees the individual's private world of experience as the starting point for an expansion that, in a living transposition, fills out the narrowness and fortuitousness of his private experience with the infinity of what is available by re-experiencing the historical world. Thus, to him, the limits on the universality of understanding that are due to the historical finitude of our being are only of a subjective nature. It is true that he still sees something positive in these limits that is fruitful for knowledge. Thus, he declares that only sympathy makes true understanding possible. But we may ask whether this has any fundamental significance. First, let us establish one thing. He regards sympathy only as a condition of knowledge. With Droysen, we can ask whether sympathy, which is a form of love, is not something more than an emotive condition of knowledge. It is one of the forms of relationship between I and thou. Certainly there is knowledge involved in this real moral relationship, and so it is that love gives insight. But sympathy is much more than simply a condition of knowledge. Through it, another person is transformed at the same time. Droysen makes the profound remark, "You must be like that, for that is the way I love you, the secret of all education." When Dilthey speaks about universal sympathy and thinks of the ripe, detached wisdom of old age, he certainly does not mean this moral phenomenon of sympathy. He is thinking of an ideal historical consciousness, which fundamentally transcends the limitations of understanding that are due to the subjective accidents of preference and affinity for an object. Here, Dilthey follows Ranke, who regarded universal sympathy as comprising the historian's dignity. True, he seems to restrict his meaning when he says that the optimal conditions for historical understanding occur where there is a continuing conditioning of one's own life by the great object, and when he regards this as the greatest possibility of understanding. But it would be wrong to understand this conditioning of one's own life as anything but a subjective condition of knowledge. We can see this from examples. When Dilthey talks of Thucydides' relationship to Pericles or Ranke's to Luther, he means a congenial intuitive bond that spontaneously evokes in the historian an understanding that would otherwise be difficult to achieve. But fundamentally, he regards this kind of understanding, which succeeds brilliantly in exceptional cases, as always obtainable through scientific method. He explicitly justifies the human science's use of comparative methods by saying that their task is to overcome the accidental limits imposed by one's own range of experience and to rise to truths of greater universality. This is one of the most questionable points of his theory. Comparison essentially presupposes that the knowing subjectivity has the freedom to have both members of the comparison at its disposal. It openly makes both things contemporary. Hence, we must doubt whether the method of comparison really satisfies the idea of historical knowledge. Is it not the case that this procedure, adopted in some areas of the natural sciences and very successful in many fields of the human sciences, e.g., linguistics, law, aesthetics, is being promoted from a subordinate tool to central importance for defining historical knowledge, and that it often gives false legitimacy to superficial and arbitrary reflection? We must agree with Count York here when he writes, "Comparison is always aesthetic. It is always concerned with the," and we recall that before him, Hegel brilliantly criticized the comparative method. At any rate, it is clear that Dilthey did not regard the fact that finite historical man is tied to a particular time and place as any fundamental impairment of the possibility of knowledge in the human sciences. Historical consciousness was supposed to rise above its own relativity in a way that made objectivity in the human sciences possible. We may ask how this claim can be justified without implying a concept of absolute philosophical knowledge beyond all historical consciousness. What is the special virtue of historical consciousness, by contrast to all other forms of consciousness in history, that its own relativity does not endanger the fundamental claim to objective knowledge? This virtue cannot consist in its really being absolute knowledge in Hegel's sense, i.e., in its uniting the whole history of mind in a present self-consciousness. The claim of philosophical consciousness to contain within itself the whole truth of the history of mind is contested precisely by the historical worldview. That impossibility is, rather, the reason historical experience is necessary. Human consciousness is not an infinite intellect for which everything exists, simultaneous and co-present. The absolute identity of consciousness and object simply cannot be achieved by finite historical consciousness. It always remains entangled in the context of historical effect. What, then, accounts for its nevertheless being able to transcend itself, and thus achieve objective historical knowledge? We will not find any explicit answer to this question in Dilthey, but all his work as a scholar gives an indirect answer. We might say that historical consciousness is not so much self-extinction as the intensified possession of itself, which distinguishes it from all other forms of mental life. However indissoluble the ground of historical life from which it emerges, historical consciousness can still understand historically its own capacity to take up a historical orientation. Hence, unlike consciousness before its victorious development into historical consciousness, it is not the immediate expression of a living reality. Historical consciousness no longer simply applies its own criteria of understanding to the tradition in which it is situated, nor does it naively assimilate tradition and simply carry it on. Rather, it adopts a reflective posture toward both itself and the tradition in which it is situated. It understands itself in terms of its own history. Historical consciousness is a mode of self-knowledge. This kind of answer shows the need for a fuller account of the nature of self-knowledge. And in fact, Dilthey's efforts, unsuccessful, as we shall see, were directed toward explaining, in terms of life, how self-knowledge gives birth to scientific consciousness. Dilthey starts from life. Life itself is ordered toward reflection. We are indebted to Georg Misch for a rigorous account of the influence of life philosophy in Dilthey's thought. It rests on the fact that there is knowledge in life itself. Even the interiority that characterizes experience, Erlebnis, contains a kind of return of life to itself. Knowledge is there. It is unreflectively connected with experience. For Dilthey, the same immanent reflexivity of life, however, also determines the way significance emerges from a life context. For significance is experienced only in our stepping outside the pursuit of goals. This kind of reflection is possible when we distance ourselves from the context of our own activity. Dilthey emphasizes, and he is undoubtedly correct, that life's natural view of itself is developed prior to any scientific objectification. It objectifies itself in the wisdom of proverb and legend, but above all in great works of art, where something of the mind detaches itself from its creator. Art is a special organ for understanding life, because in its confines between knowledge and act, life reveals itself at a depth that is inaccessible to observation, reflection, and theory. If life itself is ordered towards reflection, then the pure expression of experience in great art has a special value. But this is not to deny that knowledge is already operative, and hence truth can be recognized in every expression of life. For the forms of expression that dominate human life are all forms of objective mind. In language, customs, and legal forms, the individual has always already risen above his particularity. The great shared moral world in which he lives represents a fixed point through which he can understand himself, in the face of the fluid contingency of his subjective emotions. In being devoted to common aims, in being absorbed in activity for the community, a person is freed from particularity and transience. Droysen could have said the same thing, but in Dilthey it has its own tone. According to Dilthey, the same life tendency is seen both in contemplation and in practical reflection, a striving towards stability. This shows why he was able to regard the objectivity of scientific knowledge and philosophical self-analysis as the culmination of a natural tendency of life. In Dilthey's thinking, there is no merely extrinsic accommodation between the method of the human sciences and the procedure of the natural sciences. Rather, he sees a genuine community between them. The essence of the experimental method consists in rising above the subjective fortuitousness of observation, and with the help of method attaining knowledge of natural laws. Similarly, the human sciences endeavor to rise methodologically above the subjective fortuitousness of their own standpoint in history through the tradition accessible to them, and thus attain objective historical knowledge. Philosophical self-analysis also moves in the same direction, insofar as it objectifies itself as a human, historical fact, and gives up the claim to pure knowledge through concepts. Hence, for Dilthey, the connection between life and knowledge is an original datum. This makes Dilthey's position invulnerable to all the objections of philosophy, especially the arguments of idealistic reflective philosophy against historical relativism. His basing philosophy on the original fact of life does not require a collection of non-contradictory propositions to replace the system of thought of earlier philosophies. Rather, what Dilthey showed was true of the role of reflection in life is likewise true of philosophical self-reflection. It thinks life itself to the end by understanding philosophy as an objectification of life. It becomes philosophy of philosophy, but not in the idealistic sense. It does not try to base the one possible philosophy on the unity of a speculative principle, but continues along the path of historical self-reflection. Hence, it is not open to the objection of relativism. Dilthey himself constantly pondered this objection and sought to determine how objectivity is possible in relativity and how we are to conceive the relation of the finite to the absolute. The task is to show how the values relative to an age have expanded into something absolute. But we will not find in Dilthey a real answer to the problem of relativism, not because he never found the right answer, but because this was not properly his question. He knew, rather, that in the evolution of historical self-reflection, leading him from relativity to relativity, he was on the way toward the absolute. Thus, Ernst Trilch quite rightly summed up Dilthey's life's work in the words, "From relativity to totality." Dilthey's formulation of the same thing was, to be conscious that one is relative, a formulation openly directed against the claim of reflective philosophy to leave behind all the limitations of finitude, in soaring toward absoluteness and infinity of spirit, in the climax and truth of self-awareness. But that he was always reflecting on the charge of relativism shows that he was not really able to steadfastly follow out the logical consequences of his life philosophy against the reflective philosophy of idealism. Otherwise, he could not have avoided viewing the charge of relativism as an instance of the intellectualism that he had sought to undermine by beginning from the immanence of knowledge in life. This ambiguity has its ultimate foundation in an inner disunity of his thought, the unresolved Cartesianism from which he starts. His epistemological reflections on the basis of the human sciences are not really compatible with his starting from life philosophy. We have eloquent proof of this in his last writings. There, Dilthey calls for a philosophical foundation that would extend to every area in which consciousness has shaken off authority and is trying to attain valid knowledge through reflection and doubt. This statement seems a harmless pronouncement on the nature of science and modern philosophy in general. The Cartesian echoes cannot be missed. But in fact, the statement is applied in a completely different sense when Dilthey goes on. Everywhere life leads to reflection on what is given in it, and reflection leads to doubt. If life is able to maintain itself against doubt, then thought can finally attain valid knowledge. Here it is no longer philosophical prejudices that are to be overcome through an epistemological grounding in the style of Descartes, but it is the realities of life, the tradition of morals, religion, and positive law that are being destroyed by reflection and need a new order. When Dilthey speaks here of knowledge and reflection, he does not mean the general immanence of knowledge in life, but a movement that is directed against life. Tradition in the form of morals, religion, and law rests, by contrast, on a knowledge that life has of itself. Indeed, we have seen that in consciously surrendering to tradition, the individual is raised to objective mind. We will readily grant Dilthey that the influence of thought on life comes from the inner need to find something firm in the ceaseless change of sense impressions, desires, and feelings, something that enables one's life to be steady and unified. But this achievement of thought is something immanent in life itself. It takes place in morals, law, and religion, objectifications of mind that support the individual, insofar as he surrenders himself to the objectivity of society. The fact that it is necessary to adopt the standpoint of reflection and doubt, and that this is what happens in all forms of scientific reflection, and not elsewhere, is simply incompatible with Dilthey's life philosophy. This is rather a description of the special ideal of scientific enlightenment, which is as little compatible with a reflection immanent in life as was the intellectualism of the Enlightenment, against which Dilthey's grounding in philosophy of life was directed. In fact, there are various kinds of certainty. The kind of certainty afforded by a verification that has passed through doubt is different from the immediate living certainty that all ends and values have when they appear in human consciousness with an absolute claim. But the certainty of science is very different from the certainty acquired in life. Scientific certainty always has something Cartesian about it. It is the result of a critical method that admits only the validity of what cannot be doubted. This certainty then does not proceed from doubts arising and being overcome, but is always anterior to doubts occurring to anyone. Just as when in his famous meditation on doubt, Descartes set up an artificial and hyperbolical doubt like an experiment, which led to the fundamentum inconclusum of self-consciousness, so methodical science fundamentally doubts everything that can be doubted, in order to guarantee the certainty of its results. It is characteristic of the problem involved in Dilthey's attempt to ground the human sciences that he does not distinguish between this methodological doubt and the doubts that come of their own accord. The certainty of science is, for him, the culminating form of the certainty of life. That does not mean he did not experience the uncertainty of life in the full weight of historical concreteness. On the contrary, the more he grew into modern science, the more strongly he experienced the tension between the Christian tradition of his origin and the historical forces liberated by modern life. Dilthey's need for something firm is explicitly the need for protection from the frightful realities of life. But he expects the uncertainty and unsureness of life to be overcome not so much by the stability that the experience of life provides as by science. For Dilthey, a child of the Enlightenment, The Cartesian way of proceeding via doubt to the certain is immediately self-evident. The shaking off of the authoritative, of which he speaks, corresponds not only to the need to ground the natural sciences epistemologically, but has to do as well with the knowledge of values and ends. For him, they too are no longer an indubitable whole consisting of tradition, morals, religion, and law, but the spirit must here also produce out of itself valid knowledge. The private secularization process that brings Dilthey, the theological student, to philosophy is aligned with the historical development of modern science. Modern science does not view nature as an intelligible whole, but as a process unrelated to human beings. Scientific research sheds limited but reliable light on this process, enabling control over it. Similarly, the human mind, seeking protection and certainty, sets scientific understanding against the incomprehensibility of life, this frightful countenance. It is supposed to reveal the social, historical reality of life so fully that, despite life's ultimate incomprehensibility, such knowledge will impart protection and certainty. The Enlightenment reaches its consummation as historical enlightenment. We can thus understand why Dilthey starts from romantic hermeneutics. With its aid, he succeeds in concealing the difference between the nature of historical experience and science's mode of knowledge. He harmonizes the human science's mode of knowledge with the methodological criteria of the natural sciences. No extrinsic accommodation led him to do so. He was able to harmonize them only by neglecting the essential historicity of the human sciences. This is evident in the kind of objectivity he attributed to them. As sciences, they are supposed to have the same objectivity as the natural sciences. Dilthey loves the term and, in describing the methodology of the human sciences, he is at pains to show them as the equals of the natural sciences. Romantic hermeneutics assisted him since it took no account of the historical nature of experience. It assumed that the object of understanding is the text to be deciphered and its meaning understood. Thus, for romantic hermeneutics, every encounter with a text is an encounter of the spirit with itself. Every text is strange enough to present a problem, yet familiar enough to be fundamentally intelligible, even when we know nothing about it, except that it is text, writing, an expression of mind. Schleiermacher's model of hermeneutics is the congenial understanding that can be achieved in the relation between I and thou. Texts are just as susceptible to being fully understood as the thou. The author's meaning can be divined directly from his text. The interpreter is absolutely contemporaneous with his author. This is the triumph of the philological method, understanding the mind of the past as present, the strange as familiar. Dilthey has a profound sense of this triumph. He uses it to justify the equality of the human sciences. Just as natural science always examines some present thing for the information it can yield, so the human scientist interrogates texts. Dilthey thought he was legitimating the human sciences epistemologically by conceiving the historical world as a text to be deciphered. He drew a consequence which the historical school was never quite able to accept. True, Ranke viewed the sacred task of the historian as deciphering the hieroglyphs of history, but the idea that historical reality is such a pure thread of meaning that it need only be deciphered like a text did not really accord with the deeper tendency of the historical school. Yet Dilthey, the interpreter of this historical worldview, was driven to this conclusion to the extent that hermeneutics was his model. The result was that history was ultimately reduced to intellectual history, a reduction which Dilthey accepts in his half-negation, half-affirmation of Hegel's philosophy of mind. Schleiermacher's hermeneutics rested on an artificial methodical abstraction which tried to establish a universal instrument of the mind, but tried to use this instrument to express the saving power of the Christian faith. But in Dilthey's grounding of the human sciences, hermeneutics is more than a means. It is the universal medium of the historical consciousness, for which there no longer exists any knowledge of truth other than the understanding of expression, and, through expression, life. Everything in history is intelligible, for everything is text. Life and history make sense like the letters of a word. Thus, Dilthey ultimately conceives inquiring into the historical past as deciphering and not as historical experience. Undoubtedly, this did not do justice to the truth of the historical school. Romantic hermeneutics and the philosophical method on which it is based are not adequate as the basis of historical study. Similarly, Dilthey's concept of inductive procedure, borrowed from the natural sciences, is inadequate. Fundamentally, historical experience, as he means it, is not a procedure and does not have the anonymity of a method. Admittedly, one can derive general rules of experience from it, but their methodological value is not that of laws under which all cases could be clearly subsumed. Rather, rules of experience require experience to use them and are basically what they are only in this use. In view of this situation, it must be admitted that knowledge in the human sciences is not the same as in the inductive sciences, but has quite a different kind of objectivity and is acquired in a quite different way. Dilthey's grounding of the human sciences in life philosophy and his critique of all dogmatism, including even empiricism, had attempted to show just this, but the epistemological Cartesianism that dominated him proved stronger, so that in Dilthey, the historicity of historical experience is never truly integrated into his thought. It is true that Dilthey did not overlook the significance that the individual and universal experience of life have for the human sciences, but he defines both merely privatively. Such experience is an unmethodical and unverifiable induction that already points to the methodological induction of science. If we now recall the self-understanding of the human sciences from which we started, we can see that Dilthey's contribution to it was especially characteristic. The conflict that he tried to resolve shows clearly what pressure the methodology of modern science exerts and what our task must be, namely, to describe more adequately the experience of the human sciences and the objectivity they are able to achieve.